So welcome to our fourth salon in the series on the self in the age of simulation. This one, we're going to be talking about New Age belief and social media, how a variety of religious groups, religious trends are showing up in TikTok, Twitter, etc. So we have Esmé Partridge, who's a writer, and Katherine Dee, who's also a writer on culture and the internet. So just to kind of open the discussion, over the last several decades, we've seen a variety of different religious revivals, ranging from New Age belief, Eastern religion, evangelicalism, Islam, and the dawn of the internet, especially with social media, I think has significantly changed the course of these different religious revivals. So let's begin with this. What have you noticed about the effect that the internet has had on these various religious kind of manifestations?
I could start, I could jump in. I think Tara Isabella Burton was totally right when she said that the internet allows sort of like an a la carte approach to religion. Um, it's a lot of syncretic practices. I think that's part of the appeal of witchcraft. I don't think that witchcraft is actually more popular. I think it's the marriage of things like manifestation and the accessibility of different new age paths with this pick and choose um, sort of uh, strategy that is much easier online. And then sort of contradicting that, um, the other thing that the internet's very good at is cult-like or fandom-like um, organization. So you also see people who are kind of overwhelmed by the nature of the internet and the nature of contemporary life gravitating towards these very strict religious beliefs that err towards ideological purity. So you have both syncretic New Age beliefs and you have people like Ortho Bros, right? Where, to be an Orthodox Christian is uh, much stricter than even like a trad cath or, just going to your local like non-denominational Christian church.
Yeah, I think those are two very distinct things. And I'm gonna, just to make my analysis a bit easier, focus just more on the first one. I think I think there's this part of a wider narrative about technology and enchantment, I suppose, and sort of like the possibility of some kind of spiritual power or like the kind of appeal of spirituality and then how that works with like an internet age. I think it's quite interesting because for a very long time, the assumption was that technology would be this rationalizing force. And I think that's because, when Max Weber is writing about technology in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, the kind of technology that he's familiar with is this, factory mechanical kind of imposition of like uniformity and rationalism. So I think there was this, kind of very early equation with technology and secularization. But then I think the shift from, I guess, hardware to software and just in general, the paradigm shift, particularly that you see with the rise of Silicon Valley, the internet actually becomes something much more fluid and democratic. And at the same time, because of that, it becomes a possibly re-enchanting thing. Like it's quite interesting, the concept of cyberspace and the way that was used in the 1990s. It had this very, like the way people were speaking about it, if you look at interviews, Adam Curtis's documentaries go into this in some depth, this kind of utopic vision of the Silicon Valley pioneers. They do speak of it as this almost like consciousness enhancing space because it's something that seems to go beyond the material, right? Like that shift from hardware to the kind of simulacra and the software. There's something kind of transcendent about it, and in the way that the earlier paradigm of technology is something that you can kind of master and understand, and in that sense, it's kind of profaning. Modern technology is actually very mysterious. Like it has this kind of occult quality to it, right? Like we don't really understand it. It is re-enchanting. So I think that's like a helpful place to start, that we have this technology which is in its nature now something quite re-enchanting. I think that's kind of at the root of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and also what you're saying, Catherine, about Tara's point about how it's kind of this, it offers this opportunity for a la carte spirituality, religion, which brings me to the topic of witch talk. these varieties of forms of witchcraft that we see on TikTok, which both of you have written out about extensively. And I think you both have your own kind of particular ways into this phenomenon. So first of all, if we can explain, how do you understand, like, what do you see going on Witch Talk? Like, what exactly is it, and what are its implications? What is your take on this trend going on?
Um, so witch talk is a hashtag where people who post about um witchcraft organize all their videos. Typically, it's actually for shopping. It's a way to sell things. I think this is sort of an underrated aspect of internet-based faiths. Um, I think originally, when people so pagans on neo-pagans online have always been a big thing, and this has been present since the very early internet. There's a very famous Wired article about techno-pagans, and it was because after the late 60s, there was this sort of neo-paganism revival, right? And then it kind of came back in the 90s, but it was very difficult to organize because there weren't these large groups of people who were getting into it together. It was very disparate, and it was through like books by Llewellyn and stuff. And so originally, pagans online, it was to find other neo-pagans. And then that revival came back, and it became about selling tarot cards or blind date with a witchy book or spell kits or whatever. And then every now and then they'll do something together. Like, for example, hexing the moon. But it's not that these people are like joining covens or anything. And I think that's a huge misconception that people are very like wholeheartedly getting into witchcraft, getting into neo-paganism. But it was in the 90s, people were much more dedicated to it. And to the extent that there are people who have a real practice, they're solitary, they aren't engaging in rituals in the same way. It is a very surface level engagement. And I've noticed this even in my own life. I was at some point a Wiccan priestess, and I'm old enough to remember people were organizing on Witchbox and through indie forums, and then Facebook groups. And as it's become more popular, people have actually become less serious about it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think there is a certain irony in the fact that when the New Age movement was really big in that period of time between like the 60s and the 90s, it did actually have a kind of traditional quality to it. I mean, people would actually physically organize. They would be part of a physical group. They would often have, I mean, you yourself are a Wiccan high priestess, right? Like that is actually quite a traditional authority structure, right? Like there is a hierarchy within that. And so I think that there's a certain seriousness that comes with that. And as you say, now everything is completely like it's a relationship with a very tenuous virtual community. I suppose the biggest sign of community was when they were hexing the moon, and it was just like it was probably like 6 people or something, just into speaking into the ether, giving the impression that it's a movement. So I do think, yeah, I actually really agree with you. And in your Spectator article, Spectator World, where you were saying like, hang on, like we do need to take this with a pinch of salt because it's so easy to just borrow the aesthetics of witchcraft and make a few videos about it, and that isn't something that should be confused with a serious revival. So I am cautious about that as well.
Yeah, and I want to get a little bit more into what you were saying in this piece, Catherine, because I mean, I think Esme and I were featured in another article that was a little bit more cautious about this kind of phenomenon, warning about the ways that, yeah, like it could get you into some very dark spiritual realities. But I think you're saying, okay, but like take it with a grain of salt because, how much can you really do over the internet? How many dark spheres can you conjure on Twitter? I mean, I'm sure it's possible, but like there's something about it's the same way I think like within traditional monotheistic religions, like you can post about, all these whatever trad Catholic ortho bro kind of things, but like, are you really having an experience of communion with Jesus or the saints? It's possible, but I do think the format makes it more difficult. So, Kat, if you could just say a little bit more about like why are you kind of urging people like, okay, take it with a grain of salt. Maybe it's something serious.
Largely because I do think all people are doing are shopping ultimately. I don't, I am a strong believer that, um, whether it's manifestation or visualization, two practices that I do think are sort of dabbled in with kind of like reckless abandon, right? People don't really think about it. Even lucid dreaming or astral projection, reality shifting, all these things that I think people are trying, and they're trying without really considering what they're doing. It's still very surface level. It's still very shallow. I think that a lot of these visualization exercises could be very dangerous. And you can take this with a supernatural tack or not, right? I think it works both ways, but ultimately it's like an analogy I use a lot is, in the early 2010s, there's this huge community of polyglots, and it was like a YouTube trend. That doesn't mean that people were actually learning languages, failed or not. They weren't getting that far. It was all about the meta of what it means to learn a language. And that's very much what's going on in the spirituality space, where it's like you could buy all these crystals, you could buy all these oracle card decks, you could buy the Ouija board, whatever. They're not engaging in ritual, and therefore it doesn't matter whether or not they're safe because they're not doing it. And I don't think it's because of the medium. I think that the internet can be like very spiritually deleterious, regardless of whether or not it's spiritual in a straightforward way. Um, but it's just that it's more about the aesthetic, and so I'm not so concerned that such and such a 17-year-old says I'm a witch now. I'm making an altar, because they usually don't get as far as even making the altar.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the comparison to shopping, makes me think of an article that Bill Kavanaugh wrote, who we had on a salon yesterday, about Amazon as a form of idolatry and how I mean, it complements what you're saying in a way that, like, for him, he's saying we think of shopping on Amazon as this banal kind of thing, but in a way, it is a kind of spiritual experience because you see a variety of forms of fulfillment, which Amazon will say they have these fulfillment centers, and all you have to do is click a button and it magically appears on your doorstep within a matter of hours. But yeah, no, but I think the fact that there is this lack of the ritual, and like again, it could just be a purely aesthetic thing you're posting on the internet. Um, which, I mean, it kind of ties into what you said, Esme, about this phenomenon. I think from my reading, it sounds like you are a little bit more spiritually wary of what's going on there, but also you see it kind of as like a spiritualized version of like neoliberal consumerist individualism. Can you say a little bit more about how, yeah, what you see going on there?
Yeah, I mean, again, I do agree with Catherine broadly. I mean, I think often this is approached from a sociological point of view, and
Mhm.
you see all these arguments about how, you know, I mean, maybe I'm going slightly off tangent, but the idea of sort of enchantment and re-enchantment is it's often kind of looked at through this very historical lens, and very rarely do people actually cast value judgments on what that enchantment actually means and can it actually be spiritually powerful. And I think for me, I sort of look at it in two ways. I find it sociologically fascinating. I see it as a kind of passing phenomena, and it is very consumeristic and all of that. But then at the same time, I actually do see there being a more theological depth to it, where I think, you know what, actually, I think these kinds of aesthetics and this way of thinking actually potentially can open up ways of sort of thinking about the divine and the sort of transcendence and the self in ways which potentially can be quite dangerous. I mean, again, I don't want to sort of be too severe in my judgments here. I think in some articles I have been a bit more um responding to like very particular cases. I mean, I was doing some research on it a while ago, and I got quite deep into the witch talk rabbit hole. And I saw some very, actually quite disturbing content of this woman, for example, who'd been experimenting with Ouija boards, and she was reporting that she'd had tinnitus, like ringing in her ears. And then similarly, I saw this video, and it was this girl staring into the camera and then the text on the screen is, you were so into spirituality, what happened? And then it flashes to this montage of these like terrifying humanoid ghost figures that are in the corners of rooms, and there's this like distorted music, and it's like really disturbing. And okay, let's just suspend our suspicion for 1 minute, and let's just like say this is actually a real experience, and people are actually having these kind of adverse effects because they've, even if they've just been thinking too long about it, they've been thinking, I saw one video and a girl was claiming that she, notice these are all young women, by the way, I think that's interesting, had some dialogue with Satan, or like a reported dialogue with Satan. And I think my view is, if you're thinking about that a lot and you're kind of opening yourself up to that possibility, you are potentially exposing yourself to what could be quite malevolent spiritual forces. And like, that's a theological perspective. That's not like, there are a lot of people who won't agree with that, or will have a different kind of view of demonology and just won't think that that's the thing. So yeah, I think both. I think, yeah, it can be harmless, but I also think these are real ideas and real energies that we're dealing with, and that can have consequences.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with you. I feel like I have seen people, like quote unquote, open up their third eye too quickly. And like I said, like you could take that from a literal spiritual perspective, and say like these people are literally bringing demons into their life, or there's something about this mode of thought that is opening them up to, or conditioning them to mental illness. Let's just say broadly, using that term super, super loosely. And whatever it is, it's still, there is a danger there regardless of, no matter how you slice it. And I think that's true. um I think when I see people who are very alarmed by it, my thing is like, I don't think people are engaging with the material in any capacity. I think for the lion's share of people, it really is about giving off a certain vibe, and it's they're like playing dolls, basically.
Mhm.
And it's actually like it's very difficult to find people who are really engaging with it. Like a very telling question, and this is something that people really struggle to answer. It was when you talk to people who like if you go to for example, like one of these witch events, like witches night out or whatever, right? I go to these all the time, even now. And you ask people, what does your practice look like? They really struggle to answer it because they don't have a practice. And it's not even the question, because you can reword the question however you like. It's that they're actually just there to buy crystals and look kind of goth. And they like that there's goth music playing, and they like the big shoes, and they like the idea of a coven. But like when I was in a coven, we would always start with like 100 people who are interested, and you're supposed to keep the number at 13. And there's always some like like matriculation, like people move, whatever, people change faiths, they whatever, right? They don't like leadership. But it wasn't as like exclusive as you would imagine that something would be, because when people get down to the nitty-gritty, they don't want to study. They don't really believe, like in the Wiccan framework, that they don't believe in a god and a goddess. They don't want to learn the wheel of the year. They don't, they don't want to respect authority. There's all sorts of things where it's just like, oh, I was just here because you guys hang out at the goth club, and I thought it was cool that like 13 women in their mid-20s were hanging out at the goth club, and I wanted to be part of that. But then like when when the rubber hits the road, it's like, wait a minute, you guys actually, like, there's rules, forget it.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, I mean, we talked about the aesthetics of it, and I agree that's a huge part of it. But then there is another thing that's occurred to me having this conversation, and that's the politics of it, because that's also pretty bound up with it too. I think that's another angle maybe worth exploring. I mean, I think if you think about what have been the most, I guess, like viral flares of this kind of thing, it's been, I mean, two things come to mind. It's the like hexing Trump.
Yeah.
I forget actually exactly when that was, but there was this real thing about hexing Trump, which was on the one hand, a silly thing, and it was their way of trying to exert power against what they perceived to be evil. But I think more subtly, it was sort of a gesture of, this kind of enlightened, progressive, feminist witchcraft versus a patriarchal, conservative Christianity. So I think beneath the surface, that is a political dynamic. There was also the hexing the Taliban incident. So again, that's like, that was coming from a feminist perspective. So I think that's, I don't know which dominate. I mean, they're quite interrelated, I suppose, the politics and the aesthetics, but I think that's worth considering.
Yeah. Wasn't Lana Del Rey part of hexing Trump? I think she was,
Oh, yeah, actually, I think,
I remember some tweet from her or
yeah,
somebody. Yeah.
no one
No,
can work Lana Del Rey out politically.
no,
I
no,
can
it's
feel,
impossible.
was it like I Am 1776 did that piece of her as this like, I don't know, like trad queen or something. It was kind of fun.
Mm, yeah. No, no one will pin her down.
I mean,
And
I think like I would imagine that she's not that complicated. It's just that like she doesn't fit into like the now like thankfully like dated either you are a like trollish reactionary or you're an SJW or like maybe dirtbag left, right? Like, you know, two sides of the same coin. I feel like she just doesn't fit into the binary.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, I mean, so, but Esme, what you just said though about this kind of witchcraft is this, form of progressive feminism. We're the what's the phrase? We're the witches that you burned. I forget.
Oh,
We're the
What is
daughters of the witches you didn't burn.
Yeah, so I mean, so that's a meme I see a lot, but then there's also I see these Latinx, Latinx kind of posts by people who it's usually these like trad accounts where they'll put like a girl saying, I am practicing witchcraft because my indigenous ancestors in Latin America did this. And then they have like the abuela who's praying her rosaries and is like about to slap her for blasphemy or something. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting how these tropes kind of play out. Like, and it's I don't know. But the point is, it's making me think about Esme, your way into this about how it's like, okay, it's kind of just a spiritualized version of neoliberal individualism and how like yeah when you frame it as like okay it's we're woke witches, we're progressive because it's women who are liberated, but when you think about the proposal, like the ontological metaphysical proposal of new age spirituality, of witchcraft, like ultimately it's the exaltation of the self, of your own will, as opposed to conformity to some universal absolute being, to God, which is ultimately not, I mean, it depends how we want to define the term progress, but ultimately the exaltation of the self, like progressive for you, but not for the rest of humanity. But also, I mean, when you think of like within Christianity, the preferential option of the poor, but also in Islam and Judaism, no, like monotheism is kind of predicated on giving special attention to those who are underprivileged. So it's like, I don't know, can you say a little bit about like how it's okay, this like neoliberal individualism is kind of wrapped up in this trend?
yeah, I mean, I think it points to something much broader, which is that I think a lot of these are based on very outdated ideas of hegemony. I think the idea that, the best way to react against the establishment is to sort of be the self-actualizing individual is actually, it's just kind of false because actually, liberal individualism is that is the dominant narrative. I mean, there's nothing subversive about it at all. I mean, I think that was like the argument I made a couple of years ago in that Unheard piece, about how witchcraft isn't really subversive because it's just kind of a reflection of these individualist tendencies. And in the kind of sense of sort of do what thou wilt, there is this occult mantra which is
Yeah.
so woven into liberalism, not just now, but I would argue really from the beginning. So I think that's an important angle. But yeah, I think it's also a very good point as well, like in terms of compassion and sort of where does that leave you if you are locating the sacred within oneself, because it is very focused on experience, like personal subjective experience. I mean, a lot of new age religions are very sensational. They're sort of all about elevating one's mind to some kind of elevated state, which can actually end up absorbing you in that personal ecstasy. I mean, ecstasy, trance, these are words that are in sort of traditional new age movements quite common, as paradoxical as that sounds. But yeah, that doesn't really fit into a progressive view of humanity, and I think that's an interesting point that you made there.
Something
Mhm.
I want to piggyback off of is they're also very reliant on alternative histories, um, whether that's like Celtic Reconstructionism. Another one that's really interesting is this idea that there was ever an Italian witchcraft, Estregeria, which is like totally invented. There is like folk traditions within Catholicism that you see in Central and South America and to some extent in Sicily, but they're mostly like this idea that like your nonna was a witch is like completely invented, completely run through like this weird, not even Western, like specifically American conception of what like magic even is. I think I heard that like with like Italian specifically, like Raven Grimassi is like ground zero for all of that stuff. And the alternative history aspect has always been very interesting to me, because it also goes hand in hand with this idea of like, I'm Irish, I'm Italian, I'm a Native American. When you have no connection to these cultures, you often aren't close enough by like bloodline for it to make sense to identify that way. And then there's this very American tradition of like um, building up a narrative that is not based in anything but the collective American imagination of what it means to be XYZ heritage. And that is very bound up in witchcraft. I mean, like Llewellyn, the famous New Age publisher, probably has done more for like fake Irish history than anyone. Like the, King plastic patties, and they don't even know it.
I'm interested in what you're saying though about like how this is all often framed through this very kind of American Western lens, because my Greek grandmother did practice a form of folk witchcraft while also being a very devout Greek Orthodox Christian. And in her eyes, like the syncretism was not there was nothing contradictory about it. Like it was all kind of, I don't know, like it was a syncretic kind of whole. And even though like, so her main thing was reading the coffee grinds. And like if there was a priest at dinner, my grandfather would be like, don't do it. But otherwise she would go ahead. Um, but yeah, like she didn't think she was a witch. She didn't think she was subversive. She thought she was a good Christian who also had the gift of reading the future. And at a certain point, like I don't know, like as I was growing up, I was interested in this prospect of like, oh, psychics reading the future. So then I started getting into tarot and Ouija and all that. And I saw that it opened a lot of doors to a lot of very dark things. And I had to make the decision to completely shut that out. But like, I don't, again, like, would I try reading the coffee cups? No, but I also don't think my grandmother was this radical rebellious witch. I don't know. So yeah, I mean the framing, it's kind of
You bring up
interesting.
a really good point, of how like the certain practices are taken out of context and then reimagined as being witchcraft. Like my nonna is very similar. Like she has like an ashtray that she believes um like sort of was like had an image in it that was sort of fortune telling adjacent, and is always dabbling in things like this. And ultimately, like in her framework, like an ordinary person might be like, oh, she's like an old Sicilian witch, but in her mind, like, no, these are messages actually from Christ or
Yeah.
saints. It's not like some nebulous spirit realm. Into like whatever extent like there are spirits or demons who need to be swept out of the house, and like forget it, that they're not our friends and we don't cooperate with them.
No, it is a very recent thing. I mean, I think trying to understand what is going on there, I think it's the Reformation first trying to distance itself from superstition, because that's like a real breaking point. So in England, for example, I've been doing research into the parish church system. That's like all my brain is just parish churches. But this is actually relevant, because parish churches in this country were for a very long time actually very interwoven with parallel pagan goings on. So from the very beginning, parish churches are built on sites of ancient yew trees, holy wells, ley lines. There's this idea of a sort of pre-sanctified setting. So they're arguably quite syncretic from the outset. And then through into the Middle Ages, you've got things like Morris dancing and like, well, actually, is that an invented tradition? I don't know. I don't know what Hobsbawm would say about Morris dancing, but like there are these forms of folk tradition. I don't know exactly what, but like, local superstitions, you would say, that coexist with Christianity. So I think what happens is you get the Reformation, which very strongly reacts against that and then creates this retrospective split between spirituality and then the true faith. And then later what happens is the New Agers, they kind of unquestioningly accept that dichotomy, and then they themselves too pit organized Christianity against pre-modern paganism. So it's sort of like they actually end up repeating the Enlightenment trope of sharply distinguishing the two. And based on the examples that you've both just given, that's not faithful to the reality of the situation where for so many centuries they coexisted. And that's true in Christianity, but I imagine in other religious traditions as well.
Yeah, and this is also making me think of Carlos Ayer's recent book, They Flew, about these levitating saints in the Middle Ages. Because, he very meticulously kind of maps out how, at least within Catholicism, there's this attempt to really weed out who are the demonic witches, whatever, who were levitating, and who was it actually like a gift from the Holy Spirit. And the process, it was messy, but eventually they had developed some kind of objective criterion to discern that. Whereas during the Reformation, Luther decided that like everybody who levitated is, de facto it's like a priori they're possessed. So I don't know, again, like the same thing what I'm saying with my grandmother, like I at a certain point had to discern like, okay, there are certain things I'm not gonna do. Like I don't think it is in conformity with God's will to kind of predict the future, to like attempt to predict the future. But like I'm not gonna say like all forms of I don't know, like talking to the icons or like asking a favor to this like that, like okay, I'm not gonna say that that's demonic because anyway, but I just to your point, Esme. But the other thing I was going to ask you though, in one of your articles, you talked about manifestation techniques. And you're saying there is a parallel within Islam, and I'm sure we can also see within Christianity, where like you recognize that prayer is a sense of like manifesting a desire, but you're you recognize that like God's will supersedes yours, that like if it's not within his will, then he won't permit it. At least that's how I read it. But if you could say, can you say a little bit more about like the differences between these forms of manifestation?
Yeah, I think it is a fairly clean-cut distinction between manifestation, which is really the attempt to actualize one's own will, versus prayer, which is really ultimately about the acceptance of the divine will. So I think it's probably, I would say that would be my fairly simple distinction.
Yeah. Yeah. So, that being said, I do want to go into like the forms of monotheism that have popped up on the internet. And I mentioned before, mainly like rad trad Catholics and these Orthodox Christian ortho bros. And I think, yeah, like what we were saying before, a lot of it obviously is aesthetic. And the same way, like posting about hexing different people, putting spells, like maybe it doesn't necessarily mean you're tapping into these demonic spirits, but it could certainly open the door. I do think there's a parallel within monotheism and the internet that like, yeah, just because you're posting all these very Christian things, it doesn't necessarily mean you are having an experience of the Holy Spirit of Christ. But it potentially could open the door to it. I don't know. What do you see going on on that side of the internet?
Oh, shall I go? I was gonna wait for Catherine. I feel like Catherine being in the States, you might be able to sort of speak because I don't really know that whole like dime square tradcath thing. How
No.
real was that? Chicago, I guess, is quite far away, but like,
I'll say that I'll say this. I think that they received a disproportionate amount of attention, but the Catholic revival has been going on online for a very long time. It reached a fever pitch a little bit before the first Trump administration, and then it was it was still happening, but it was kind of like under the radar, and then it got more popular again. And then because Times Square takes so many cues from the online right, and when I say online right, I mean a very diverse ecosystem of tens of thousands of people who are more not left than they are strictly right wing. I'm not talking about the dissident right in particular, but because they take so many cues from that ecosystem of people online, they ended up getting the credit for it, right? Because they started playing with the aesthetics and they have access to New York media. So, who knows about them? But I will say that like here in Chicago, there's a church, St. John Cantius, and they still do traditional Latin mass. And like I would always see very young people there. For a while, I was going to a Catholic. It was for people who. So this particular church has a lot of classes that they offer, like um, Greek and Hebrew and stuff. And so there's all these like little splinter groups of like young adults who um, will get dinner and stuff, and it's very intellectual and it's very intellectually stimulating. And there's just tons of people, and I don't think those people are necessarily connected to Times Square, but I do think they are learning about this stuff from the internet, and they're choosing that particular church because they know from what people say online that like they do have all these they have all these classes, they do TLM, etc. I don't know if everyone is necessarily faithful, but I think it's partially a way to relieve boredom more than it is to have spiritual communion of any kind. Um, to meet other people, I think it could be a proxy for being educated, um, or for not being a normie. Basically anything but finding your way to God, which is, I mean, you know, maybe maybe it's always been the case.
I mean, before you respond to the question, Esme, I just wanted to jump in and mention. So, I mean, Catherine, when you came on my podcast a few years ago, I mentioned how I kind of found my way into trad Catholicism through Tumblr. And, believe it or not, there was this big Tumblr Cath community, which was like pretty horrible now in retrospect, probably because it was online, but also like, I don't know, like it attracted these very self-righteous, very like nerdy people who were just like posting insane stuff about, I don't know, just like very stringent stuff about doctrine and how, I don't know. So like that's how I found my way into Latin Mass and all that. And eventually I started to see like objectively, I do think that liturgy is very beautiful. But the cultural phenomenon surrounding it is not only unattractive, like I do think there's something kind of unchristian about it because like I mean the point of Christianity is like God enters into the world. We're supposed to be going out into the world, not hiding in our doctrine and our very, pristine forms of liturgy and spirituality. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but like when it becomes this escape, Christianity is not about escape. It's about going out. And yeah, like it's this claim that God enters into the world. So like if we're hiding from the modern world, sure, like in the world, not of it, but like the point is you got to be in there. And especially if we're on the internet doing these things, like I don't know, not to be a doomer, but there's something like antithetical to like it's not conducive to like this belief in the incarnation if we're doing it all. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of like a cringe take, but I believe it. I don't know. Esme, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it is very bound up with reactionary politics, and I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm just not. Like, it's just empirically there is such a clear overlap between the two, and I think it becomes, it's like an act against a perceived degeneracy of the modern world and all of that, which, like, to some degree I do sympathize with. I mean, I was partly drawn to it because I liked the idea of some everlasting sacred tradition in a postmodern world. Like that has a very obvious appeal that's, not ultra political. It more just comes from a place of dissatisfaction. But I think that it is bound up with quite an extreme critique of modernity, a critique of the Enlightenment, which actually for quite a long time I was like very kind of just swallowed whole, actually. And only now am I sort of nuancing it slightly. I mean, that's kind of a whole other, philosophical issue. But I guess my main concern is that when something is negatively premised like that, like we're going to the Brompton Oratory because it is a gesture against modern degeneracy or what. I mean, that is a word that I have heard used. And I just think when you're starting from that base point, it's not that somebody might not start from there and then be opened up to something genuinely light and positive and have a transformation. And so in that sense, I suppose it's a good way in. But whether that's really happening for most people, or if this is just their vessel right now for that kind of politics and could easily change, I think be interesting to see what happens in the next 5 or 10 years.
But also as like a cope for psychological maladjustment or immaturity. Like that's my, aside from like the fact that I don't think it's conducive to like the main, living out the main tenets of Christianity. Like I see how it becomes an excuse for a lot of people to not deal with the fact that, yeah, like they aren't fully developed psychologically. They have certain anxieties. So let me just stay in my cozy little cave of people who agree with me so I don't have to learn. Hey, not to be mean, but I'm just saying I see it, and it's not a judgment against people. It's like out of charity, I hope that people can, grow, get the help that they need rather than because I see how like I'm not innocent of this. Like I know how I've used that as a cope, and it's debilitating. Like we should be able to like function in the real world.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
also think there's something. Oh, sorry to cut you off.
Oh, no,
I
no,
was
please.
going to say, like, I think there something that we haven't mentioned, but we've sort of danced around is, um, even if you are, as in the case of Times Square or the Chicagoans I mentioned, like going to a weekly dinner or certain parties or study groups or whatever, these are still happening outside of the fabric of a wider community. I don't think like a dinner or a party circuit is enough to constitute a community. So it's still in a sense sort of a la carte because it's like there's no accountability. You don't really know what it's like to be immersed in these beliefs. It's like you're going to the weekly show, the weekly LARP, the weekly dinner to act this out, and then online to maybe like tone police people or whatever, however it manifests. But you're not, it's very hard to like make this a lifestyle, which you are really embodying. And I don't think a lot of these people want to embody it. I think there's an attraction to talking about embodying it because to be in these communities is to be faced with just how antithetical to modern life it really is. Like I think a lot of people wouldn't actually like it. It's why like we've been talking about Islam, and you see this a lot with converts to Islam, or reverts to Islam rather. They go really hard, really fast all at once, and then they do have the opportunity to be fully immersed in a community, often of a culture that is not their own, a language they do not speak, and then they burn out because they go all at once and it's kind of like they're speeding straight into a wall. And for some people, very rarely they end up married and they sort of change their whole life and they're part of this new community. But I think most people don't actually appreciate the amount of responsibility and change that these very traditionalist faiths really demand of you if you're doing it correctly or if you're doing it in totality.
And it's also just so antithetical to the spirit of tradition. I mean, tradition itself it's like a dynamic action. It means to hand down, to pass down, to inherit. So if you're, maybe it's a slightly elementary point, but if you are adopting something out of your own choice and you're choosing to embrace it, then it's just not by its very definition traditional. It's maybe a postmodern kind of traditionalism, and maybe that's its own phenomena, and that's just the inevitability of it for some people. I mean, it's like I don't have a default tradition. I don't, my parents and, well, all of my family behind my parents were all Catholic, but that was just broken off, right? That was just completely broken off with my parents. So there's no natural liturgical rhythm that I would fit into. It all has to be rediscovered, and in that sense, it just, you know, will never be traditional. I think it would just be good if people could embrace that, I think, and then just sort of, you know, accept that. But I think when you try to reconstruct that tradition artificially, I do think the danger is just getting yourself into an echo chamber. And maybe that's like stating the obvious, but I was confronted personally with quite how narrow of a social sphere I've kind of ended up having, because pandemic happened and then that changed the nature of work. I mean, all of the jobs I've ever worked have been either completely remote or like one day in an office and everything's remote. And so you end up really selecting for people who are so, you know, they're like maybe 1 or 2 degrees ideologically away from you, but they're never far. And I think people have lost that. And I had a very, sorry, I'm just talking about like very anecdotally here, but I do think it's relevant. I had like a very kind of grounding experience recently. I went to an event with just like 200 people from completely different, like it was, you know, I went there to do a talk and I was not expecting it to be such a genuinely diverse group of people. And like I felt just so, it just felt so right, just like talking to strangers and disagreeing with people. I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't experienced this for about 2 years. Not really by choice, just because that's the way that the world works now. If you have a job like we do, everything's kind of atomized. So I do think I do think that's actually quite concerning that that's happened to a lot of people and they may not even realize it.
Yeah. I was wondering, Esme, do you, since Catherine brought it up, do you have any thoughts on like, I'm seeing a lot of these British Muslim influencers who, like Kat is saying, are kind of reactionary to like, oh, the decadent West. I don't know, do you follow any of these people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always been, well, not always, but historically there's been sort of like two extremes. Because on the one hand, there's the very educated convert to Islam who's usually like high society, someone like Abdullah Quilliam,
Mhm.
who's often thought of as the first Muslim convert. It's a very high society Orientalist thing. But then it's also something that you now see among the working classes, which is maybe it's more of like a cultural belonging.
Okay.
It's like
Yeah.
it's a very different social phenomena, but sometimes kind of from the outside, it takes on quite similar characteristic. There is this British Islam kind of aesthetic. It's very interesting. I don't know how exactly it fits into all of this, but
Yeah, because I mean, I see a lot of it's, I mean, it's mostly Middle Eastern people in the UK who are, I mean, like very, very kind of reactionary to, again, the decadence that they perceive. But I mean, but on that note, I did want to also, before we wrap things up, I wanted to bring up the ortho bro thing because I mean, I wrote a hot take I had on it that was like a little maybe too inflammatory, but growing up with part of my family being Greek Orthodox, seeing this trend, like I think there's something about Orthodox Christianity, the fact that it is so much intertwined with ethnicity. Part of me thinks that it's kind of, I'm not going to say impossible because anything's possible for the spirit, but like really hard if you're not growing up with some experience of one of these ethnic groups to really grasp Orthodox Christianity because like reading books, reading on Tumblr about Orthodoxy, it's very different from like growing up with a Greek or a Russian family and like I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I do think with the Orthodox thing, like it is a very particular thing because unlike Roman Catholicism at least. Like the ethnic piece is there, but like you have the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian, the etc. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think people are attracted, superficially attracted to things with high barrier to entries. Um, I think the reason that people are attracted to uh, different strains of Orthodox Christianity is the same reason people are attracted to communism or fascism,
Hmm.
because you like do it correctly and it does impose a lot of order.
Yeah.
Um, and there are, in theory, like high costs to breaking rules. And these are people who, even more than everyone else already feels, have a lot of personal chaos. So it's an organizing structure. Um, but it like comes out in this very like maladapted way.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen Esme, you have thoughts on that? I have more, but curious to hear what you think.
I'm not sure. It's like something I've never really studied in much
Really?
depth. I mean, I know Seraphim Rose, who's a
Mhm.
very famous American Orthodox convert and who was very influenced by Guénon and this critical of modernity stance. And again, I think was quite driven towards Orthodoxy because he saw it as some perfectly pure form of Christianity that was the ideal counterpoint to that. But beyond that, I'm not super clued up on it.
Because I think it was ever since Rod Dreher converted that I'm seeing more and more of these, at least in the US, Americans, former Protestants, evangelicals converting to Orthodoxy. And like, at least, in the US, we have the, what is it? We have the Russian Church outside of Russia. We have I forget, they're like the non-ethnic ones, which are mostly for converts. But then, like at my family's Greek Orthodox parish, you'll have these, non-Greeks showing up, and they're like doing the women have the veil. Greeks don't veil. They don't. It's not a thing for us. And they have the prayer rope, and they're super doing all the prostrations over and over again. And all the Greeks are looking at them like, "Who the hell are you? Like you clearly are not one of us." And I don't know. I mean, I think it's a very particular phenomenon, very distinct from the trad cat thing. But no, so before we open it up for questions from our guests here, I do want to kind of close on maybe a little bit more of a hopeful note. I mean, we've said plenty of things about how the internet is a hindrance to authentic religious experience, but I don't know, like what are the most positive things you see coming out of these trends? Like where do we find some hope um, in again these various iterations of religion on the internet, if any?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's parallels why I think broadly postmodernity is probably a better position to be in than modernity.
Yeah.
Because in modernity, you are having this fixed set of ideals imposed upon you, and that parallels with this kind of rigid kind of secularism or materialism, which I mean, arguably has never really prevailed. I mean, there's the book, the Myth of Disenchantment by I just forget his full name. Jason Josephson Storm, which is a really good book all about how we've never been disenchanted. But let's just say the alternative is a world where there is no openness to the idea of the spiritual. I would rather be in a position where perhaps there's a little bit too much openness and people have this new freedom to explore different things. I mean, it's far from ideal, but I think I can't help think of sort of my own situation where actually it's precisely that freedom that's opened up so many of these interesting ideas and philosophies. And so I think, yeah, I think as you move from the modernity to postmodernity, or solid modernity to liquid modernity, if you like. I think that phrasing is I really like that way of putting it from Zygmunt Bauman, is potentially positive, opens up that enchanted garden again in a way.
Yeah.
Excuse my cold, which I've been coughing through this whole thing. It's hard for me to say because there's such a diversity of outcomes. Um, I do think that for some people, some of these things introduce routine, hope. Certainly, I don't think all manifestation is bad. For example, I think people get kind of crazy with it, as like the Twin Flames documentary from HBO showed us. Like there are ways in which you can get delusional and like fall into cults and whatever. But for the most part, like it introduces a hope to people, and then occasionally, certainly not always, you meet people and you make friends. um I think like anything where like that you're meeting people in person, I tend to be supportive of. um but otherwise, I don't know. It depends on the person. I think for the most part what ends up happening is people buy a bunch of shit they'll be interested in for 6 months and then they forget about, whether it's they're buying a very beautiful Bible to put on their bookshelf and never open, or a beautiful rosary, which they'll never pray. I mean, it's just like or crystals or whatever. Um, I think most people, it just ends up being another outlet for home decor, charitably speaking.
Yeah, and I mean I would agree with you guys, especially I mean what you said, Esme, about, post-modernity. I mean, this is kind of the agenda of cracks in postmodernity that, yeah, I mean, it opens the floor for so much, for kind of our humanity, what is most true to emerge again. Sure, it obscures the truth in plenty of ways, but I do think there is more space than modernity allowed. And that's why I ultimately am not a complete doomer. That's why I do have hope. I do think there's more, again, there are cracks for the spirit, for the truth to come in. So yeah, that's my
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I think that's fundamental to it. If you believe in truth and you
yes.
believe and you have faith, then it will find a way of disclosing itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately that no, I mean this is why for people who genuinely believe, like we can't afford to be completely pessimistic because like the future is not in our hands. Like it's not up to us to save the world from Western decadence or for their depravity. Like ultimately, if there's an all-powerful being, then they've got us covered, you know. So anyway, all right. So if anyone has questions, you can either type it into the chat, you can unmute. Let's go ahead and start. Unless nobody has questions. Let's see.
You can throw the invite link up on Twitter real quick, and we'll get a flood of people.
Yeah, that will certainly. We're gonna do it like hashtag witch talk or something like that. No,
They might all flock and then like change the whole course of conversation. That'd be quite funny.
there's questions. Well, if not, I mean, if Esme and Catherine, if you have questions for each other, that's also fair game. Are there any
Ooh.
things we didn't cover?
Do you think I'm too cynical, Esme?
Um, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think I'm cynical towards when people look at this purely sociologically and they aren't willing to engage with the theological claims at stake. And I do know, I mean, it's not really surprising. I mean, the sociology in this country is an incredibly secular discipline. And I found that when I was doing study of religion, believe it or not, that is treated as a form of sociology, which is actually really quite, I mean, hostile really to the positive truth claims of theology. When really there should be a, yeah, that's not the ideal relationship between the two. And in a similar vein, I do think a lot of when I read this literature on enchantment and disenchantment, I think, well, there is a need to go a bit deeper and think, well, what does this actually mean spiritually? But I think it's like a matter of interest, isn't it? I think all your analysis, it doesn't preclude that side of things. And actually, I find your analysis often very thought-provoking for me about these kinds of things because it like highlights these trends and sort of it's like a springboard, you know?
Oh, thank you.
No, I really enjoy your work, Catherine. I think like you're like one of the only people who like you've like made such a niche for yourself with the internet archaeology, and I think it's yeah, I think it's really great.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't think anyone else is. Yeah, no one else is doing it. So it's important work to be done. All right. So if there are no questions, I'll wrap it up. No, I just want to kind of draw out some of the main things that stood out here. I think while we have plenty of criticisms and skepticism about these trends, like I do think the fact that it exists, first of all, is a sign that like people are seeking something. Like there needs to be some kind of larger meta narrative surrounding our existence beyond like get a job, make enough money, and then die. So sure, there are laws and like finding these niche internet religious communities, but I think it's better than just blindly living life. But also, as Catherine was trying to emphasize, like there is a communal dimension, albeit a very limited one, but I think there's a fundamental intuition of like, no, like life is not something that we live in complete isolation, but also these ideas, like pursuit of truth is not something you live just in your room by yourself. Ultimately, yes, like if you're only doing it on the internet, effectively, you are kind of just doing it in a room. But oftentimes these open to in-person meetups and hopefully to like genuine, like a real communal religious experience. But yeah, no, I think if anything, like these are some of the like the true kind of values within what we see happening. And I do hope though that like this people do dig a little bit deeper once they get into these internet communities because yeah, like there is like each of these religions in their fullness like offer a lot more than what we were seeing on within these like fringe communities. But that's kind of my takeaway from all this. So thank you guys for being part of the discussion. I was really looking forward to bringing you guys together ever since I saw your articles coming out at a similar time about the witch talk stuff. But
Thank
yeah,
you. Thank you for hosting us. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise.
yeah. So our this was the last of our virtual salons in the series. We are going to be hosting an in-person one in New York, date to be declared probably sometime in October. More information on that. But yeah, thank you guys for joining and
We'll be in New York that time of year.
then you
Well,
should come.
late October, more November, but I'd be very
Okay.
keen. Let's talk
Well,
about that.
even if it's not if you're not here for the event, we should meet in New York. Yeah, of
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you again.
course. Thank you guys. All right, have a good day. Take care.
Bye. See you.
Take care, Esme. Bye.